Next up, we have Keith Babo from Solo.io, where he runs their product team. Keith is also a member of our foundation board and the chair of our events committee. So one of the fine folks that you can thank for putting together a fantastic event. So I would love to hand it over to Keith to do our next talk. Keith.
Intro music, that was cool. Okay, hey everybody, this is awesome to see. It's so exciting. This is the first official GraphQL conference put on by the GraphQL Foundation, so it's really cool to see everybody here. I'm particularly excited about this talk because we were thinking about, I work for a company that does application networking infrastructure for like cloud native applications, right? So if you're running in Kubernetes or cloud providers and this type of thing. So it's really exciting to follow Marc-Andre because he gave an awesome talk from the perspective of someone that is so steeped in API design and experience from a code first and kind of like programming standpoint on how you address your architecture with APIs. And I'm coming from the absolute opposite direction, from application networking infrastructure up, right? And so it'll be interesting to see how these interplay. So we were excited about this topic, and then we looked at the schedule and realized we had 5 minutes. And so they were like, Keith, keep it brief. And I'm like, okay, so let's start with a brief history of the World Wide Web. So I think this is super relevant because the web's been around for 33, 34 years, right? Many macro evolution and innovation cycles that we can learn from within the GraphQL community, which is, more or less 8 years old from open source. So it all started with Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, right? He did the first web page. This is actually still on the internet, which is super cool, this first web page. Built the web server, basically a static server serving a single resource, which is this page, which was cool. Academia was really excited about it, started creating more pages. What was the first phase shift? No longer serving, there we go, static content. I love these old diagrams, but this is awesome. This is actually like, I don't even know how old, but this describes like doing CGI, if folks know what that is, not computer-generated images, but Common Gateway Interface. Back in the day, the first time we did dynamic web pages is with a Perl, right? And we just did it in CGI bin, and it was awesome, right, back then. And so the whole idea there was a client can give us some context, and we can dynamically generate content for that client on the server. And critically, what that involved is not just a single server with a single resource, but multiple HTTP servers that were then brought together to serve that content dynamically, which is very much like what we might do with resolvers today with GraphQL APIs, right? What's the limiter here? So this is a great phase shift. And then you see many entrants, by the way, start to enter this market beyond Perl, like the Java and .NET communities get involved, build entire frameworks around how to generate dynamic content from the server, which create a whole bunch of really powerful applications, okay? The problem was that every time the content changed, the client's making a round trip to the server, and this got very expensive. There's many ways we tried to, dance around that. Then around 2005, a little application called Google Maps, which you may have heard of, came out. The first, as far as I know, first really large-scale use of AJAX to create rich, dynamic client, browser-based interactive experiences. And it was just mind-blowing what you could do and how much this changed the game of the browsers executing. You serve some static content in JavaScript to the browser, and then everything's just a data round trip to the back-end APIs. I mean, this just completely changed the web and continues to change the web as we know it today. So from here, great, now we actually have this really dynamic experience. I think even in the industry today, we're bouncing between server rendered and client rendered and this type of thing. But then there was another phase shift around the same time where we say, hey, instead of a conceptual model of a single server serving this content and maybe the data, why aren't we distributing that to the edges of the globe, really, with content delivery networks? And this started with streaming video and images, but now you're building entire static sites and then deploying them to edge CDNs and running them from there, and maybe even doing some edge compute. So all of these fundamental shifts are examples of an innovation cycle that kind of acts as a flywheel, okay? It all begins with dynamic, engaging user experiences that make users happy about using the web. The happier they are, the more they want to do on the web, which increases the number of use cases that we want to implement on the web. The increased market size and appetite for those use cases has more community members start to enter the market and create solutions in that market. So now we have more choice. That choice creates competition and refinement, which increases performance. And ultimately, now when I want to go deploy a new web application or content on the web, the community has created this broader and deeper foundation so that I'm building off of. So I'm not writing a CGI bin HTTP server from scratch, but I have all these awesome frameworks and all these great tools to use. All right? So cool. That's the beginning of that. Now let's apply this to GraphQL real quick. So actually, speaking of monoliths, like you should always start with a monolith, right, when it comes to GraphQL. And what do we do with this, right? So we start a GraphQL server, we implement a resolver to talk to some upstream data sources, and now we have a GraphQL API that's a single endpoint that's described by a schema that you can go interact with. This is all awesome. And it's so awesome that we say, hey, it's not just this backend data source and NoSQL store, relational store I'm dealing with. Now I want to have I have a bunch of REST APIs and gRPC APIs and other API types that will increase the data that's available in my graph, increase the value of my APIs. Ignore the top. We'll get to the top part of this photo and the image in a minute. But focusing on the bottom part, what's a phase shift we start to see here? How much time am I spending writing resolvers and code to wire in those backends? And how much of that is boilerplate code that doesn't differentiate me, that's just a bunch of time I spend, that's not actual incremental business value? We see that a lot, at least from our standpoint. And so in the community, you start to see solutions where resolvers, like there's frameworks and libraries for resolvers, technologies that can generate resolvers from databases that get you started if you're going from a coding perspective. Even full-blown GraphQL servers that can just stand up a GraphQL API from an existing resource in place, which is a huge time saver. But now, let's look at the top of this diagram. That's not really what we want, right? Well, maybe we do. Marc-Andre made a good point. It doesn't have to be one graph for the entire world, right? But let's say we wanted a single access point for all of our data. Now we're talking about composing our graph. And you're going to hear so much of this conference, and you've seen so much in the community around stitching, federation, open federation, GraphQL Fusion, all this great stuff. Why this emphasis on this area? Because it's such an important area to have vendor neutrality and a common base of implementations under a spec that we all share and understand the behavior of that capability. And so you'll hear a lot more about the conference there, but a really important network shift there because that commonly becomes something called a gateway, which Marc-Andre also mentioned. And in that gateway, in our experience, you're always putting that in front of something that's a load balancer, a circuit breaker, a rate limiter, doing authentication, authorization, and this type of thing. This is very common in cloud-native architectures. And so yet another phase shift that we really like is the ability to build GraphQL directly into that network. If you already have an ingress, if you already have a gateway that's handling these things, treating GraphQL as another layer 7 protocol that you can support as a first-class citizen at the gateway level or maybe even the sidecar like a mesh layer. And then finally, the same thing we saw with the web, we're seeing with GraphQL, where we see actual being able to cache and keep GraphQL responses out in the edge in the CDN layer. Really cool stuff there, not just for performance, right, but also maybe for protecting against DDoS attacks, increasing your security posture as GraphQL gets even more popular. All right, so rushing through this, one last comment to make here. What's the takeaways here? The first I want to say is you'll hear so much at this event about the great things the community is doing and innovating around GraphQL. Think about that holistically. Your first step is not going to necessarily, or every step in your GraphQL journey is not going to be implementing a GraphQL server from scratch, right? So look and kind of study what these solutions and approaches are here. And realize, maybe somewhat in contrast to what Marc-Andre said, but I think there's room for both of them, is that you don't necessarily need to write code for every GraphQL endpoint in your architecture. And there's certain things like composition of graphs that could be declarative in nature. And think about that as you approach the solution domain. And then finally, more important than everything, as we've seen with the web, you don't want to be the wrong side on the GraphQL ecosystem's evolution, right? So think about where the community is going overall. Pay attention in the sessions, and like start to plot your course with GraphQL based on what the community is doing here. One last thing, we have a booth here solo. I'll be there, so if you want to talk more about this was a little bit long, but I can talk about this all day long, obviously. So please join me there and love to talk to you about it more.